And greetings YouTube gamers, welcome to another episode of Retro Raider. My name is Johnny Retro and welcome to the channel. Okay, so today I'm going to show you guys my Super Nintendo collection and talk a little bit of the SNES on the current retro gaming scene. So I started collecting for the Super Nintendo way back in 2010 and I think that 2010 was a turning point on the retro gaming collecting scene because it was that year where prices just went crazy. The prices were already a little bit high compared to years before, but it was definitely not as bad as it is today. So I picked my Super Nintendo unit for a cheap price, and by cheap I mean cheaper than what it is right now. But at the time I was more focused in Mega Drive and PS1 games, because those were the systems that I grew up playing with, and to be honest with you, I was never a huge Nintendo fan, aside from the handheld consoles. And in 2010 the only Nintendo home consoles that I had was my original N64 and the NES. But the 16-bit era, you know, the fourth generation of video game consoles is actually where my heart is. And that's pretty much why I wanted to pick a Super Nintendo. But nowadays it's crazy to collect for this system, especially if you're going to complete in-box games. I think that Super Nintendo is becoming the next Neo Geo or something like that. It is just a very expensive system to collect at the moment. It is very hot right now on the retro gaming collecting scene, especially here in Europe. Nintendo was always more popular in North America, and you know, on a small country like Portugal, nowadays it's very hard to find games for the Super Nintendo. So to keep the story short, along the years, you know, when I start to get more interest on the SNES, you know, the prices were already outrageous for my wallet. So this is what I got. This is my humbled Super Nintendo collection, and you know, I feel very proud with what I got along the years, and I can honestly tell you that 90% of this, although it's little, I got it on the wild. You know, hunting on flea markets, doing trades, talking to friends, and not just rely on eBay. So without further ado, let's take a closer look of my Super Nintendo collection right after this. So my Super Nintendo set, and let's take this huge beast out of the way. This is actually the set that I picked up back in 2010. This is not a Portuguese unit, you know, released in my country, but it is a PAL unit. It is the Super Mario All-Stars edition, and of course it comes with a console, 2 controllers, and Super Mario All-Stars, which is right here. And this is the only loose game that I have for the Super Nintendo, because it was the pack-in game. And for new Super Nintendo collectors out there and Mario fans, this is actually a great way to start. I also got this from a friend. He gave this one to me. And this is an extra controller for the Super Nintendo. This was the controller that it was sold separately, and this is actually the Portuguese edition. I hope that the camera can focus. See right there? In Portuguese. It actually didn't come with the controller. My friend just gave me the box. But it's just a very cool item to have on the shelf. Now, another thing that I've picked when I first got the Super Nintendo, and this is not official, this is the Game Revival card. Now, there were a lot of adapters like this back in the 90s, and what this adapter allows you to do is to play imported games. So I can play, of course, my PAL games, my NTSC games, and Super Famicom games. But the biggest advantage of this is that it creates save slots of your games. Now, with the Retron 5, I actually don't need this anymore, but I used to use this a lot back in the day when I first got the Super Nintendo. And I'm not entirely sure, but I've heard that these things go for a big amount of money these days. Now let's take a closer look of my games. Let's start with this one, and this needs no introduction. It is Chrono Trigger, and this is actually the only Super Famicom that I have on my Super Nintendo collection. And for me, the biggest advantage of getting Super Famicom games is how cheap they are. I mean, compared to the PAL and NTSC versions, these games go for about 1/5 of the price. Now, this was the only game that I've picked on eBay from my Super Nintendo / Super Famicom collection, and I think that I've paid about, it was not even 20 euros when I got it. Shipped. I bought this game last year, and I had never played Chrono Trigger before. I was very hyped about this game because it is considered one of the best RPGs of all time, and it truly is. It truly is one of the best RPGs that I ever played. Now, unfortunately, and that's the biggest downside of collecting for the Super Famicom, is that I don't know how to read Japanese. So I played this game on my Return 5, with the original Super Nintendo controller, of course, and I used an SD card with a translation patch in order to play this. And I know that it is emulation, but, at least I get to play the game from the original cartridge, and that's why I picked this game. And I'm honestly planning to get more Super Famicom games, especially exclusive games and RPGs. Because as you all know, collecting RPGs for the Super Nintendo, it's outrageously expensive. So Chrono Trigger, definitely give it a try if you haven't already. Now let's see what we have here. Prince of Persia. I actually did a review of this game a couple of months ago where I talked about this particular version and also my history with Prince of Persia. And I will leave a link of that video on the description box below if you guys are interested. Now this game of course needs no introduction, and I think that the best version of the classic Prince of Persia is the Super Nintendo one. So, one of my favorite games on my Super Nintendo collection. Another classic game, Star Fox. So I got this relatively cheap on a gaming convention a couple of years ago. Classic Nintendo game, I'm very happy to have a complete copy of Star Fox, and I'm very looking forward to Star Fox 2 on the SNES Mini. Now this one is a little bit weird. Young Merlin. So this is a game that I knew nothing about it, and I got it on a bundle a couple of years ago. And the bundle was mainly NES games, but the guy just threw this one in. It's actually another Portuguese edition, it's an RPG, and it sucks. This game sucks, it really does, and I think this could be a very good contender for my Let's Play Weird Video Games segment. Crappy game, but it's a guilty pleasure that I have on the Super Nintendo. Now this next one is definitely a hidden gem on the Super Nintendo library, Weapon Lord. So this is a fighting game. It was also released on the Mega Drive, but to be honest with you, I prefer the Super Nintendo version. I actually knew about this game before I got it, and this is not a cheap game. This one is expensive, it really is. I think that a loose copy of this is about 50 euros. Another one that I found in the wild, and I'm very happy to have this game on the collection, really. So the theme of the game, it kind of resembles Conan the Barbarian. You fight with weapons, a little bit gorish, and I always find it funny, adult games or video games for adults on a Super Nintendo system. Because, Super Nintendo was always more focused to the younger generation, I think. Aside from the RPGs back in the day, it really was. So, very cool game on the Super Nintendo, Weapon Lord. So if you like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, you really can't go wrong with Tournament Fighters. Another fighting game, and this is of course based on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles universe. And I can honestly tell you that this is probably the hardest fighting game that I've ever played. And that is probably the downside of the game, because this game is absolutely hard. It is a very, very challenging game, it really is. There's actually a Mega Drive / Genesis version of this game, but I never tried it out, but from what I've heard, it is a completely different game. And like Weapon Lord, this is also an expensive game. Now, the last fighting game on my Super Nintendo library, and if you're a Super Nintendo collector, of course that you need a Street Fighter game, and this is my copy of Street Fighter Turbo. This is actually my favorite version of Street Fighter 2, and I think this was the second game that I ever got for the Super Nintendo. So what can I say about Street Fighter that it hasn't been said before? It's one of the most amazing fighting games ever. It's just an iconic video game franchising, and I think that Street Fighter 2 is one of those games that, in 50 years from now, gamers are still going to play this game. Definitely a must-have on the Super Nintendo. Last but not least, probably one of the best RPGs of all time, A Link to the Past. This one is actually my favorite Zelda game of all time. This is actually the American version, this one is NTSC. And I bought this 2 years ago here in Portugal for 5 euros. This one is actually one of the best deals that I've ever made. And the guy that sold me this guy was actually a collector, but he just didn't care about Nintendo stuff. He told me that he was more focused on Mega Drive, and he just didn't care about Super Nintendo. So he sold me this, completed in box, very good shape, the manuals, the map, for 5 euros alone. So as you can see, there is still hope, there are still good deals to be made out there. This one is definitely the crown jewel of my Super Nintendo collection. There you go guys, this was my SNES collection. I'm not obsessed with having everything when it comes to a system or when it comes to my collection as a whole. And I really don't know why, but Super Nintendo is one of those systems that I really like to collect everything completed in box. And as you can see, for example, that doesn't happen with my NES collection, I only have loose games. But for the Super Nintendo, I really want the completed in box versions. I really don't know why, but That's how I collect for it. But probably the reason is that it is a 16-bit console, and I just love the fourth generation of video game consoles. You know, that's the generation that I grew up playing, and I do the same thing with the Mega Drive actually. I only collect completed in-box Mega Drive games. And that is probably one of the reasons why I don't have too many games. I know that it is a humble collection, but I'm very happy with what I have. And it was a pleasure to showcase this to you guys. Especially with the prices these days, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, but I'm not going to give you guys any advice on the Super Nintendo because I'm actually not an expert on it. So what I'm going to do instead is to ask you guys advice, so please let me know in the comment section below what do you think about my collection, and leave me some thoughts of games that I should have. And also, what do you advise for new Super Nintendo collectors out there? And as always guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe to the channel and take care of yourselves, take care of the gaming community, and game a lot.